Hello, I'm Shadowy. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. On this episode, we're diving into Russia's hybrid war in Europe. Now, when you think war, your mind probably conjures up tanks, planes, and soldiers. But what if I told you, war doesn't always come with explosions? Sometimes it comes with a carefully planted social media post or an energy deal so shady it could moonlight a Bond villain. For years, Russia has waged what we call a hybrid war across Europe, a cocktail of cyberattacks, disinformation, economic coercion, and occasionally little green men popping up in Crimea. It's essentially warfare for the 21st century, messy and hard to trace. So without further ado, let's take a look at the latest chapter in this story.
Investigators have recovered the flight data and cockpit voice recorders from a DHL cargo plane that crashed near Vilnius, killing the Spanish pilot and injuring 3 others. The black boxes are now being analyzed as officials search for answers about the cause of the crash.
Maybe some technical problems or interference were in the aircraft, maybe some neglect. But this is a research hypothesis that allows us to get a direction for the investigation.
The plane, which departed from Leipzig, Germany, was attempting to land at Vilnius International Airport when it skidded hundreds of meters upon impact. Amid rising concerns about Russian sabotage targeting Western cargo planes, some have described the incident as potentially linked to hybrid attacks.
We must say at this point that the very fact that together with our Lithuanian and Spanish partners, we must now seriously ask ourselves whether this was an accident or another hybrid incident.
Lithuanian officials, however, remain cautious, noting that there is no current evidence to support claims of terrorism or external interference.
Whether it was a technical error, pilot error, or something else, we need to wait a bit. The investigation may take up to a week.
This crash follows reports of sabotage in Europe, including fires at DHL depots in Germany and the UK over the summer. While speculation about Russian involvement persists, no direct links have been confirmed.
And now, as always, it's time to explore the issue in greater detail. So, let's begin. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, this hybrid war is entering a dangerous new phase. Imagine Russia's previous tactics as a low-budget spy movie, spying on your emails, spreading fake news on Facebook, that sort of thing. Now, however, it's like they have been handed the blockbuster budget. We're talking increased sabotage, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, and even cozying up to political extremists across the continent. Take Germany, for example. Earlier this year, their rail system experienced a massive shutdown due to a so-called technical issue. But was it a technical issue after all? Or was it Russia pulling the strings, like an evil puppet master who really hates efficient public transport? And speaking of efficiency, let's not forget the cyber attacks on European energy grids, leaving millions of people wondering if their blackout is from a storm or a hacker with a grudge. Russia's game plan is clear: destabilize Europe from the inside out. And they're getting creative. Remember the Brexit? It didn't just happen because British people woke up one day and collectively decided to relive the glory days of imperial isolation. Russia's disinformation machine played a subtle yet significant role in amplifying the divide. And they're not stopping there. Far from it. From funding far-right parties in France to stoking anti-vax sentiments in Italy, Russia has its fingers in every European pie, which frankly is a weird mental image because I don't picture Vladimir Putin as a pie kind of guy. But why now, you may ask? Well, why is this considered actually a phase that is more dangerous than it was before? Well, it's time for some answers, right? This is all partly because of the timing. Europe is facing a perfect storm of crises: economic uncertainty, post-pandemic recovery, and, of course, the ongoing war in Ukraine. Russia knows this is the moment to turn up the heat. Take the energy crisis, for instance. Europe's dependency on Russian gas has always been a vulnerability. But now it's like a sword dangling over the continent's head. Every time Europe tries to transition to alternative energy sources, Russia plays the gas card, or rather yanks the gas card away. It's economic blackmail, but with the flair of an ex who keeps accidentally showing up at places you hang out. Hybrid warfare thrives on ambiguity. That's the point. If you can't definitively say, yes, Russia did this, it's harder to push back. This plausible deniability gives Russia room to maneuver. So the big question is this: how do you fight a war that isn't technically a war? Russia's hybrid war in Europe isn't just a geopolitical game. It is a test of resilience, cooperation, and creativity. And if Europe can't rise to the challenge, the consequences will ripple far beyond its borders. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Joshua Bergen, Program Coordinator for the Warsaw Security Forum. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Nice to be with you, Anash.
So, the entire Russian hybrid warfare issue, if this was a Quentin Tarantino movie, would you say that we're in the middle of a Mexican standoff, except one of the gunslingers keeps kicking everyone else underneath the table, and everybody else just tries not to notice?
I think that's a great metaphor. I think that Russia has for a very long time engaged in a range of activities across the Western Hemisphere, and it's almost as if the thought leaders, the elites, leadership in Washington, Brussels have just sort of considered a cost of doing business rather than directly taking this on head on and educating their publics in a meaningful way.
So this is perhaps when the metaphor may actually prove to be slightly inadequate. It's a very recent development, one could say, because, kicking beneath the table implies there are no victims. But the time, of victimless crimes is kind of drawing to a close with the DHL flight disaster. One person was killed, a few others were injured. So when would you say Europe, NATO, and basically everyone involved should draw the line? And I know just, how unfashionable it is to talk about red lines, because we know about Russia's red lines, they don't seem to work. But when do you think a response would be in order, after all? And ignoring the whole situation would no longer be an option, basically.
Fair question. I think it's premature to adjudicate the plane crash in Lithuania as being caused by the Russians. Should we be concerned? Certainly the Lithuanians are engaged in due diligence with their investigations. I would imagine they're bringing in other allies and partners to look at some of the evidence, collecting black boxes, etc. The notion that this crash could have been caused by Russia is not out of line, in so much as Russian agents have been apprehended, already attempting to put incendiary devices on other cargo flights. So this certainly would fit within a pattern. That said, we're not limited to this incident alone. We've seen arsons across Europe as far as the UK, issues in Poland and other near abroad countries. The Rheinmetall CEO in Germany was targeted for assassination back in the summer. That plot was foiled. Many of these plots have been foiled, but nevertheless, if this indeed is confirmed as an incident where Russia is implicated, or indeed was able to bring down this cargo liner, it would be a significant move forward in the sense that it would not have been an interdicted incident. There's real losses involved here.
And also, we're talking about this as if it was a new phenomenon, but if we actually press rewind, the Skripal assassination case, again, that people were killed and there were chemical weapons involved. Of course, back then, the response was perhaps slightly more limited, given that the military situation was not quite as intense as it is today, but to some extent, this has been done before, which brings us to the most fundamental question. Who do you think is going to break free of this, this idea that, we cannot do anything because we cannot escalate, and Russia is actually calibrating all these measures not to trigger anything like Article 5? So are we going to stay that way, forever, simply, waiting for Russia's next move?
So I think you make a great point that this has been going on for a long time, and it predates Skripal. It predates even the recent 2000s. It goes all the way back to Project V, an effort of the Soviet Union to put assets in Europe and the United States that would be deployed to wreak havoc through sabotage, through means of media and disinformation. There was a range of activities that really go back to the Soviet Union. And as we see the leadership of Russia today under Vladimir Putin, they're relying heavily on this same playbook. To your point, I have been a strong critic of the U.S. over the past years in its reluctance to engage. its misunderstanding of how to deal with Russia. The notion that it's going to play a mutually beneficial game it's a fantasy. Russia will not play a mutually beneficial, I'm okay, you're okay, let's find maximum benefit for both of us. Russia operates in zero sum. And unfortunately, I think many of the foreign policy thought leaders in places like Washington, D.C., and even Brussels have come from a school of thought where zero sum is not a possible way to approach the world. And they don't even learn how to counter those leaders, such as Vladimir Putin, who operates in zero sum. The idea that Russia continues through these meetings to sort of tiptoe up to the line of not drawing a response, it's like a bad child that's sort of testing mom and dad. I think it's long past time for Europe and the United States, the parents, so to speak, in the situation, to go ahead and not just draw a line, but to act decisively to respond.
So what do you think should happen next? Article 4, perhaps? And also, if any country comes up with an idea of using Article 4, do you think it could actually be foiled by the likes of Hungary, perhaps Turkey, who wouldn't simply be on board with measures like that?
Well, like it or not, if we look at past ways the world has functioned, these things are often best executed when they're not talked about, but simply done. I think part of the Western problem is there's a great deal of hand-wringing and not a lot of action. I think many of our governments have become sclerotic and they overcommittee things. I would appreciate if we would see some decisive action. If we've seen sea cables cut, where's reciprocity with communications infrastructure in Russia coming down? If we're seeing a plane come down, where's similar sort of reciprocity? Operating in a similar vein. I mean, you don't have to go back and go to the bully and say, okay, you hit me, I'm going to hit you back. If you got kicked under the table, kick back under the table. And to that end, I think perhaps some of the escalation we've seen from Washington around weapons that are able to be used in Ukraine, it may be in part to some of these escalations on Russia's side. That said, I wish that across the Western world, there was a better accounting for the kicks under the table. For instance, the cyber hacking that has taken place across the Western Hemisphere that has literally cost our societies trillions of dollars in direct cost, in insurance and remediation costs, and our general publics are completely and totally in the dark about how Russia has impacted their real world, their standard of life, their costs for the past 2 decades. I think that's a huge miss on the part of our leadership.
So why do you think we're not doing this now? Is it because the West simply doesn't do plausible deniability anymore? I mean, when Russia does something, they will always say, it's not us. These were independent actors acting on their own accord. We've got nothing to do with this. We would have never, ever done anything like this, etc., etc. So the West theoretically could, like you're saying, respond in kind, but it does not. I mean, cyber operations are a good example. Very difficult to trace. And of course, something that probably shouldn't be talked about in the open. But I mean, you know, if we were diplomats or members of governments, we probably wouldn't be talking about it. But on this forum, we can. So what do you think is the main hurdle stopping countries of the West in adopting this approach?
Well, I mean, this goes into greater societal questions, and I'm probably going to be unpopular when I say sometimes education ends up limiting behavior. And highly educated people sitting around a table that have been socialized to they must agree, frankly, these are not recipes for good clandestine behavior. These are things that probably need to take place in committees of 2 or 3, not 7 to 12 with 15 layers of approval. The idea that someone somewhere is deputized to engage in reciprocity. This is a very narrow need-to-know activity. If we look at past history, and frankly, I don't think culturally right now in Western governments that these sorts of things are normative. Do I think they should return? Likely, because Russia's not stopping, and we have been ignoring this now for the better part of 20 years. I think the best way to remediate a bully is to kick the bully once he's kicked you. If it's under the table, it probably needs to continue to be under the table, or there needs to be a full-scale communication with our publics about why we're going to go to a full-scale war with Russia, which, again, I think that has its own problems and has great costs. I'm not in support of that. I think probably it's better to, with a ball-peen hammer, take knocks at Russia as opposed to trying to stage, something with large scale of forces.
Of course, so what should be the triggering event here? We are investigating this plane crash, obviously. The Lithuanian services are investigating. No doubt they will be asking other countries to provide useful information. But we've also had, as you've mentioned, a foiled assassination plot. We also have GPS jamming. This runs the risk of a major disaster should, for example, a passenger plane crash because of that. There are reports that members of the Russian Orthodox Church are being used as spies in Sweden, for example. So we have spies in Kazakhs. What do you think would be the moment when basically there would be a consensus among countries of the West that this cannot go on that way, that something needs to be done, and that something would need to, go beyond basically, establishing more offices, buying office chairs and computers, setting out agendas, but ultimately, Russia will be just sitting back and saying, okay, they are still doing nothing, and we can still continue with impunity.
Nash, you raised a good point, this notion of a trigger. I don't think we're there yet. And even if there was evidence that would come out on this DHL cargo freighter crash, even if there was evidence, I don't think that's a sufficient trigger either. If we look back to 2014 and little green men crossing over to the border of Ukraine, much of the Western world was wringing its hands, completely wringing its hands, not even making strong, there were some declarations, but it wasn't even unified declarations. It was the downing of the Dutch airline on its way to Malaysia, if I recall, that forced the Western world to respond. This was the trigger event that caused the West to engage. I think, sadly, short of something that's that visible and that obvious, there's going to continue to be, at least under the current leaderships, there's going to continue to be a reluctance to take action. Do I think that's a mistake? I do, because to your point, Russia has continuously learned that it can do these things and expect no consequence.
So that is
I wish I had a different answer at the moment, but that's my perception.
Well, it's a realistic forecast, a grim one, but a realistic one at that as well. Unless perhaps somebody is listening and also, looking at many other comments from commentators and experts and finally decides, okay, so perhaps it's time for a change attack. It's been that time for quite a while now, as you've mentioned. But, it's better late than never, I guess. Joshua Bergen was our guest today here on Eastern Express. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thanks for the invitation.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Western leaders are intensifying their efforts to solidify support for Ukraine amid rising concerns over Donald Trump's stance on the conflict. Some experts say that frozen Russian assets valued at $300 billion could play a pivotal role in safeguarding Ukraine's future.
As Donald Trump prepares to take office, the Biden administration and other Western leaders are doubling down on efforts to solidify Western support for Ukraine. European nations are also considering additional funding to ensure Ukraine's negotiating position remains strong, recognizing the high stakes for global stability. Concerns about U.S. support for Ukraine have grown since Trump's victory. The president-elect has called U.S. aid to Ukraine a waste of money and has signaled a willingness to strike a deal with Russian President Vladimir Putin to end the conflict. Hugo Dixon, an analyst cited by Reuters, suggested that a resolution favorable to Ukraine could hinge on utilizing $300 billion in frozen Russian foreign reserves to fund its defense, an asset that could both appeal to Trump and convince Putin that Ukraine can endure a prolonged war. These funds, primarily benefiting US manufacturers, could pressure Russia by signaling the West's readiness to sustain Ukraine's fight. Trump could use this leverage to warn Putin that continued conflict, pushing for a mutually acceptable agreement.
A decision to unify Kazakhstan under a single time zone is causing an uproar, as residents in the east grapple with longer winter nights and early sunsets. The change, intended to correct a Soviet-era practice, has drawn complaints about health, safety and economic fallout, with businesses struggling and citizens petitioning for a return to the previous two-zone system.
In Kazakhstan, a sweeping time change has plunged parts of the country into literal and metaphorical darkness. A presidential decree this year unified the vast nation under a single time zone, erasing the previous two-zone system. But with winter's short days setting in, many eastern residents are struggling as darkness now falls as early as 3 p.m. The decision, intended to correct what officials called a Soviet-era historical injustice, has drawn widespread criticism. Some residents now facing dimly lit streets during their evening commute report health issues, decreased productivity, and concerns for children's safety. Businesses, too, are feeling the pinch. Restaurant patronage has dropped sharply, and rising electricity costs are hitting small businesses hard. Despite petitions and protests, the government is standing firm, claiming the change simplifies governance.
A not-so-shocking report has been released for those who are ever wondering whether Russia actually meddles in the affairs of as many countries as it is often said. According to a declassified US intelligence report obtained by Bloomberg, Vladimir Putin has had his hands in several assassination orders.
Vladimir Putin has often been regarded as a very dangerous man, though the extent of his involvement in some gnarly business is often overlooked. This report obtained by Bloomberg alleges that Vladimir Putin had personally authorized multiple assassinations of political opponents. It also describes the Kremlin's efforts in targeting political figures in former Soviet states. One of these cases includes the possible attempt on the life of former Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko, who had suffered a near-fatal poisoning in 2004. The US intelligence reports warns that Russia will likely continue such operations, as it has the capabilities to track dissidents and opponents both at home and abroad. One of the most known instances of such attacks was the 2018 assassination attempt on Sergei Skripal in the United Kingdom, and the poisoning of one of the Kremlin's greatest opponents, Alexei Navalny, in 2020.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.